The story begins in a remote valley of Colombia, where Pastor Guevara is complaining to God, asking why he gives so much pain to those who truly love him. He says that he has already lost half of his flock to famine, drought, and disease. Just a short while ago, he had a nightmare, in which he was performing the sacred ritual of baptism, bringing people back to the path of God. But the moment he submerged the landlord's only son, Martin, into the holy water, he saw something truly terrifying. Perhaps a sign that the days ahead will be even more dreadful. Here, Dr. Grace Victoria Burnham is on a visit to Colombia. She is a well-known alienist from New York. In fact, some time ago, she received a letter from a woman named Isabel from the Marquez Ranch in Colombia, in which Isabel described her son Martin's strange behavior. Isabel had also written about Martin's unimaginable intellectual abilities and supernatural powers. Dr. Grace found Martin's case quite fascinating, which is why she came here in person. She wants to see the patient as soon as possible, but Father Antonio first introduces her to Martin's father, Nicolas Marquez. Nicolas Marquez is the landlord of this region. He has no shortage of wealth, and people call him Don Marquez, but he's a bit conservative. He had assumed the doctor would be a man. So far, he's only seen women cooking, cleaning, and bearing children. He does not approve of a woman treating his son. In a sarcastic manner, he tells Grace that they don't need a nurse, and that his servant Temo will take her back to the station tomorrow. Grace felt disappointed by Don Marquez's conservative behavior. Firmly, she said, "I'm not a nurse, I'm a doctor." Grace is a strong and independent woman who, in this age of patriarchy, has earned her place in society through sheer determination. She told Marquez clearly that if there's a patient in this house, she will see him, no matter how ignorant his father might be. Marquez flared up, saying he would not tolerate being disrespected in his own house. Father Antonio intervened, trying to calm him down, explaining that Grace's return train was a week later, so perhaps it would be better to let her stay until then. Then Father Antonio took Grace to Martin's room. There was a large lock on the door. Seeing this, Grace was surprised and asked the father how anyone could keep a child imprisoned like this. Father Antonio replied that it was the only way to keep everyone safe. Father then introduced Grace to Martin. At first glance, Martin appeared to be a gentleman. The color of the retinas in his eyes was different. Martin behaved very politely with Grace, yet there was something unnatural about his demeanor. When Grace entered the room, she had heard Martin's music. She praised it and tried to understand Martin's personality through the posters hanging on the walls. Martin handed her a book saying, "Could you please read this for me?" "Of course, why not?" Grace replied, but first, she wanted to ask Martin a few questions. She began asking him about his likes and dislikes. Martin said he liked cowboys. He even wanted to become one someday. He was also a great admirer of Buffalo Bill. Then he asked Grace if she had ever seen Buffalo Bill. Grace told him that she had been present at Buffalo Bill's World's Fair show held in Chicago. Buffalo Bill was world famous at the end of the 18th century. He used to travel around the world, dramatically presenting the life of cowboys and the Western way of living. Martin's room was filled with piles of books. When asked, he said some of them were given to him by his mother. Then he added, "But she can't give me any more books now, because I killed her." Saying this, Martin became deeply sad and began playing the violin, lost in the memory of that day when his mother was teaching him horseback riding. Both of them were so happy, but suddenly, the rope that tied the horse slipped from Isabel's hand. As she rushed to grab it, she tripped and fell. Before she could get back up, the horse trampled her. Martin was so absorbed in riding that he didn't even notice his injured mother, and right there, Isabel breathed her last. Grace was shocked. She tried to talk to Martin some more, but he was so lost in the melody of the violin, as if that music alone was the cure for his pain. Grace was angry. She asked Father Antonio why he had allowed such an idea to grow in Martin's mind, that he had killed his own mother. Father said that it was the truth, because that's exactly what had happened. He believed that God was angry with them and had sent Martin here as punishment. He said that ever since the day Martin was born, a swarm of locusts had invaded the region. The land began to dry up, crops were destroyed, people and animals started dying. Father Antonio invoked religion and compared Martin's birth to a plague, calling it a curse sent by heaven. Father Antonio's words sounded illogical and unscientific to Grace. After all, she was an educated, intelligent, and modern woman. She told Father clearly, "We're dealing with a psychological illness here, and it shouldn't be connected with religion. This is a scientific matter, and we will treat it scientifically." Grace believed that Martin was suffering from mental trauma, made worse by the guilt of being blamed for his mother's death. That day, she asked Martin to take her to his mother's grave. Father tried to stop them, saying they were safe only within the walls of the house. But Martin ignored his words, and the three of them went to Isabel's grave. Martin was praying for his mother along with Father when Pastor Guevara arrived there with his armed men. The pastor wanted to kill Martin, believing he was the root of all their troubles. Grace and Father Antonio tried to reason with him, but in that moment, Martin used his powers to control one of the pastor's cowboy's horse. The cowboy fired his gun. But instead of hitting Martin, the bullet grazed Pastor Guevara's shoulder. Seizing the moment, Grace put Martin on a horse and fled from there. But Father Antonio was caught by them. They whipped him mercilessly, tearing the skin off his back. Grace treated him, and when he opened his eyes in the morning, he saw Martin praying for him. Father began telling him the story of God and Satan written in the Bible, when suddenly Grace arrived there. She sent Martin out of the room. It seems Dr. Grace is an atheist. She asked the father if he truly believed in all this. Father Antonio's faith in God is unshakable. He believes every word, every line written in the Bible is the word of God. But today, he is disappointed in himself, because in the battle between God and the devil, he feels he has grown weak. He confessed that just a few lashes from Guevara broke his spirit. In front of everyone, he admitted to every accusation Guevara made against Martin. Admitted that Martin is the embodiment of Lucifer, the fallen angel who rebelled against God. He accepted that all the troubles of the valley are rooted in Martin himself. Meanwhile, another one of Don Marquez's cattle has died. Fearing that people might again accuse Martin, he took the carcass to a deserted area outside the village to burn it. While he was doing so, Grace arrived there too, saying that this place is no longer safe for his son and that he should move him somewhere secure. Marquez is worried. Half of his cattle are already dead, and of those that remain, many are infected. He tells Grace to go back home. The next morning, a man named Andres stood at Don Marquez's door with his two sons. As soon as he saw the father, he stretched out his hands and said they hadn't eaten in days. At first, the father refused, trying to explain that Marquez's fields were as barren as everyone else's. But when he saw those starving boys, he couldn't hold himself back. He gave them some fruits and vegetables. Seeing boys his own age hungry, Martin couldn't restrain himself either. He gave them his whole chocolate, as if in exchange for that chocolate, he wanted their friendship. Today, Don Marquez came to meet Grace. He hadn't expected her to stay here for so many days. Grace believes she can heal Martin, but even though Marquez is his father, he too believes the boy is cursed. He told Grace about his daughter, saying she was stillborn, and he buried her by the riverbank. Isabel was in shock, crying her heart out, but perhaps Martin didn't like seeing his mother cry. He dug up the cadaver from the grave and brought it back to his mother. After all, who does such things? Grace thinks Martin has savant syndrome. Savant syndrome is a condition in which a person displays extraordinary ability in one particular area, like art or mathematics, and such ability often coexists with some form of social or intellectual impairment. Grace tried to explain to Marquez that it's a disorder, one that can be treated with modern medicine, not by priests or religious myths. Don Marquez remained silent, but the hopelessness on his face made it clear that he trusted religious myths and priests more than science. The next day, Grace secretly took some belongings in her bag and left early in the morning. She had come to the village for a funeral. Those very boys to whom Martin had given the chocolate had died. She tried to make Pastor Guevara and the villagers understand that Martin was not a devil, that he was mentally ill. But Pastor Guevara refused to believe in Grace's science. Instead, he called her a witch and struck her with 5 or 6 lashes. Luckily, at the very last moment, Don Marquez arrived, waving his gun in the air. Grace's life was saved. There is a severe famine in the valley. The fields have turned barren, and the remaining crops are being destroyed by locusts. Don Marquez is not spared from this calamity either. He doesn't know what to do. Seeing his father so worried, Martin couldn't hold back and said, "We have 11 acres of land, but only enough seeds left for 13 quarters. Even if by some miracle the crops grow well, which seems impossible, we still won't have enough food to survive the winter or feed our animals." According to Martin's calculations, to survive they'll have to kill their 14 cattle, before the animals die of hunger on their own. Grace has begun Martin's treatment. In the first session, she shows him various ink blots created by different psychologists, asking him how he feels when he looks at them. At first, Martin ignored both the ink blots and Grace's questions, but when she showed him another one, Martin saw his mother in it, though when asked, he said maybe it was just a butterfly. Today, after many days, it has finally rained in the valley. Father Antonio is overjoyed. He praises Grace's work, saying it seems like she's finally managed to establish a connection with Martin. Out of curiosity, he asks, "What do you really see in Martin?" A boy born with extraordinary abilities, Grace replies. A boy who can access parts of the mind that others don't even know exist. Grace adds that such abilities often come with certain deficiencies. Martine lacks an understanding of social behavior and empathy. Tonight, everyone had dinner together. Seeing a woman at the dining table again brought joy to Don Marquez. Ever since Isabel's passing, the family had been missing a woman's presence. With Grace around, Martine no longer feels his mother's absence as deeply, and watching Grace's devotion toward his son, Don Marquez found affection welling up inside him. Eventually, he confessed his feelings. They grew close and kissed each other. The next morning, Marquez was teaching his son Martine how to farm, how to prepare the soil, how to sow the seeds, and so on. When Martine held his hand for the first time, Marquez's heart overflowed with fatherly love. That night, while the whole family was absorbed in prayer, someone set fire to the stable. Marquez and Father Antonio ran toward it, but Martine remained on his knees saying, "This is wrong, the prayer isn't finished yet." He began shouting loudly. Grace completed the prayer and told Martine to stay put, then rushed toward the stable. To save his cattle, Don Marquez ran into the burning stable, where Andres was hiding with a shovel in his hands. He was the one who had started the fire. Seizing the moment, Andres struck Marquez on the head with the shovel, and Marquez collapsed unconscious to the ground. Moments later, Grace came inside too, trying to help the unconscious Marquez. Before Andres could harm her, Martine appeared, but instead of helping his father or Grace, he quietly sat down and began playing with a wooden horse. Andres wanted to kill him to avenge his son's deaths. Grace tried to stop him, but failed. Just as Andres was about to strike, Martine looked into his eyes, and Andres suddenly lost control of himself, as if something had taken over his mind. In that instant, a burning beam fell from above and crashed onto him. Andres died right there. Grace was stunned to see all this. Anyway, the three of them survived, but the stable burned down to ashes. Enraged, Don Marquez tied Andres' charred body to his horse and dragged it all the way to the village church. Seeing Andres' corpse, Pastor Guevara cried out in agony. Meanwhile, to everyone's surprise, Father Antonio ran into Dr. Grace at the church that very day. She told him she had witnessed something during the fire that was simply impossible, because her science does not allow her to believe in things like witchcraft, God, or the devil. She was disturbed, realizing that she had thought Martine merely suffered from some kind of mental disorder, but during the blaze, when she saw him subdue both Andres and the burning plank, she was completely shaken. She said to Father Antonio, "If even I can't look at Martine without prejudice like everyone else, then how will I ever be able to help him?" Father Antonio replied that God works through us, and it was he who sent her here. Grace, in a tone of sarcasm, said, "No, God sent me here. And if there really is a God somewhere, he abandoned us a long time ago." The incident at the stable only deepened Martine's depression. He blamed himself for the destruction happening in the valley and for Andres' death. Grace tried to explain to him that none of what happened, or is happening, was his fault, that it was Andres who set the fire, and it was he who perished in it. The next morning, when Don Marquez reached his fields, he saw that someone had sown salt all over them. He broke down, telling Grace that now nothing would ever grow in the fields again, nor would he ever be able to work there with his son, because someone had sown salt in their land, and now the crops would never grow. Grace had begun the second phase of the treatment. Through pendulum therapy, she was trying to hypnotize Martine, asking him questions about his mother, his fears, and his lies. But the move backfired. Using his powers, Martine hypnotized Grace instead. And when he asked her about her own lies, Grace said, "I'm a fraud. Because I repeat the teachings of the world's greatest minds, yet am not one of them. I travel to every corner of the world trying to prove myself, but all I ever find is failure." The hypnosis broke, silence filled the room. Before leaving, Grace said to Martine, "That wasn't a lie, it was my fear." The people of the valley were already suffering from famine and drought, and now the plague had begun to spread. Don Marquez's house was no exception. Even the housemaid, Maria, fell victim to it. Temo, Father Antonio, and Marquez all believed that Grace would save her, but sadly she couldn't. Grace's courage was breaking. She said to Don Marquez, "I'm not the person you all think I am. I'm a fraud." Marquez tried to lift her spirits, saying, "For the first time, I've truly come to know my son. This is just an illness, just science. But what you've done for my son, that is a miracle." Meanwhile, many people in the valley had already lost their lives to the plague, and Pastor Guevara's rage had reached its peak. Believing Martine to be the root of all evil, he prayed to God for the strength to destroy him. He gathered the people of the valley and, quoting from the Holy Scriptures, delivered a fierce and incendiary sermon, then led the furious crowd toward Don Marquez's mansion. Don Marquez was already aware of the valley's condition, so he had begun preparing to leave. He couldn't pack much, but he took a few precious jewels and a photograph of his wife, Isabel. Before they could escape, the enraged mob had already reached the mansion. Handing a revolver to Grace, Don Marquez said, "You might need this, because that crowd will show no mercy." With that, Don Marquez and Temo took their positions and began defending the house. Their aim was deadly accurate, and they took down several attackers. But the mob was too large. Don Marquez couldn't hold them off for long, and he was shot. Father Antonio led Martine and Grace to a secret passage, but from there, they had to go on alone. He said he would stay behind and try to hold off the mob. Father Antonio hoped the people would listen to him, but when the crowd broke in, they didn't even give him a chance to speak, and brutally killed him. When Grace and Martine came out through the secret passage, they ran into Temo, who told them that Don Marquez was gone. But before Temo could get them out of there, the crowd standing ahead spotted them. Still, as long as Temo was alive, no one could reach Martine and Grace, but sadly, the mob took Temo's life too. There was no way out now. The crowd had surrounded them from all sides. Watching Temo die right in front of her, Grace was in shock. For a moment, she even pointed the revolver at Martine, perhaps thinking that killing him would spare them from the mob's wrath. But she couldn't do it. Instead, she pulled Martine behind her and fired at the raging crowd. The furious mob pounced on them. When Grace regained consciousness, she found herself tied to a post, surrounded by people shouting, "Witch! Witch!" Pastor Guevara had decided to kill Martine and burn her alive. Just then, Don Marquez, covered in blood, mounted on a horse, and holding a gun, arrived at the scene. But he couldn't do much. The mob rushed at him, attacking from all sides. Seeing his father being beaten to death, Martine cried out in anguish and unleashed his powers, throwing people away from his father one by one. The crowd panicked and began to flee in terror. One man tried to burn Martine, but Martine's powers turned the flames back on him, burning him alive. Pastor Guevara tried to shoot Martine, but his gun exploded in his hands, killing him instantly. Grace stood frozen, shocked by what she had just witnessed. As the mob scattered, she helped Martine lift the wounded Don Marquez onto the horse, and they rode toward the train station. The train had not yet arrived, and Don Marquez was breathing his last. Grace promised him that she would protect Martine no matter what. Hearing this, Don Marquez took his final breath. Grace and Martine, with heavy hearts, had no choice but to leave him behind. The film ends here. I hope you liked the story. If you did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.